Welcome to Sketchbook Legends. I'm your artist, Paul Hostetler, and today I'm a little bit more of an artist than usual because I think for the first time I'm going to be using some watercolors in my sketchbook. I'm injecting color into the channel like TV in the 60s. And I don't think I'm even using my sketchbook today. But before we get into that, I'd like to announce that I'm drawing a mermaid. That's going to be the subject of today's sketchbook legend. I'm not drawing any specific mermaid. There are a bunch of named historical, or not historical, but mythological mermaids that show up in folklore around the world. And there are also a few mermaids that are under copyright or trademark protection in the United States, and those are easy enough to skirt because, except for the various derivations of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, Disney's especially, I think mermaids are mostly in the public domain. Now, instead of my usual sketchbook, I'm drawing in a Canson Artist Series watercolor paper pad. It's a little bit larger than I usually work. I think this one is 11 by 14. When I picked out this paper, I did not realize that drawing at a larger size would mean drawing for a longer amount of time. So I think this is also the longest video that I've ever made. Just putting the paint down on paper takes way longer than I thought it would. But as you can see, as with any sketch that I do at least, I'm starting out with pencils, especially if you're going to be layering it with watercolor. I like to start with pencils just so as to get an idea of what the shapes are going to be. I'm a little bit incapable of drawing neatly, especially at the pencil stage. So, you can notice that I've got a very light touch with that pencil. That way I can erase the errant marks later. Anything that I don't want to end up on the final piece, because once you put watercolor over pencil, it sort of adheres the graphite to the paper, and it's much harder to erase. As to the pose of the mermaid, I decided that to do sort of a variation on that classic Disney Little Mermaid pose where she sort of jumps out of the water and there's a big splash, wave crashing behind her, and she's singing Part of Your World, I think. That's all well and good for a Disney musical, but I didn't really want to do like a teenage girl mermaid for YouTube and takedown reasons. So my mermaid is a little bit of a scavenger pirate. She's been collecting bits and bobs from sunken ships. She's gonna have an eye patch, a bandana, a little pistol, a flintlock pistol, and a sword, and she's gonna be wielding those as the wave crashes behind her in a sort of declaration of war against the land, which I suppose is exactly the opposite of the Little Mermaid's stated goal of going to live on the land. Instead of immigrating, she's invading. At least my mermaid is. You can see as I'm erasing that I'm wearing a cloth glove I need to do this when I'm working with wet media because for whatever reason, I've got oilier skin. Maybe it's just genetic, maybe I just eat too many Fritos. But what happens is if I rub my hand or place my hand on a sheet of paper, oil comes off of it, gets on the paper, and then wet media won't stick to where the oil is. Oil and water don't mix. Skin oil and water don't mix. And that includes watercolor. So I have to wear gloves on pieces that I'm taking seriously so that I can be sure whatever media I'm throwing down on the sheet is going to actually stick, and there won't be like weird little areas that are in the shape of my palm or my fingerprint just sticking out and not having any paint on them. You can see here I'm drawing, I've put a little eye patch on my mermaid. I've got the gun, I've got the pose already. It's time to start painting. The watercolor paints I've set up are just a little travel set of Winsor & Newtons. I think this one actually was bought by my wife to do a little plein air painting. Probably cost something like 25, 30 bucks. This was a few years ago. As you can tell, it's kind of an old set. I've got a larger tray that I use for professional work, not with the little dried out cubes. I've got tubes of watercolor to make sure that they all stay fresh. But those take even more time to set up than this. You can see that I didn't spend a lot of time setting that up. I just popped open the box and sprayed it with a little water spritzer bottle. And part of the appeal of getting started with watercolors is that you can just buy a $20 or $30 box and get some pretty decent quality paints and start painting. And build up your skills. You don't need any linseed oils or palettes or canvases stretched. It's a very beginner-friendly medium. Alright, what I'm doing here is I'm just laying down some areas of color. I suppose I could have used a bigger brush for that, but since this is Sketchbook Legends, it's all going to be a little bit quick and dirty. Most of my professional work comes with a clause stating that I can't post it or advertise it before the company or the patron has revealed their product. So for my own benefit, for my own sketchbook, this is what you get, is the quick and dirty stuff. And with watercolor, it's actually beneficial to just slop down areas of color in order to see what the composition is like. While the paper is wet, you can see it's wet because it's shiny. And while it's wet, that means the paint can still be moved around a little. If you need to remove a little of the color from an area, you can go in with a paper towel and dab that out. If you decide you need a slightly different shade, you can add a little bit more color of that shade. I've got a sunset behind my mermaid, so it's all very orange and red. Oh, and some yellow up top. That sunset color is bleeding into the figure of the mermaid. But like I said, we're slopping it in. It'll all make sense in the end. And a little bleeding color will help all the hues cohere into a single piece, really, because light doesn't stop at the edge of any sort of object. It sort of bounces around, hits it from the other side. And in the case of things like skin, it actually goes through the skin and is refracted. Skin is a little bit translucent, so it's all right if at this early stage not everything is neat and tidy. I've got sort of an olive green for the color of my mermaid, and I'm putting in sort of a dark aquamarine, dark teal. There's probably an actual word for it, as you know, concocted by the Pantone Corporation. But I wanted a two-tone mermaid, and I didn't want my mermaid to be skin-toned, because that's just like a big beacon in the ocean, begging for predators to come over and take a bite out of you, is to color yourself, you know, human colors. You'll notice that most of the fish in the ocean are sort of silvery gray or blue or white, with a little bit darker on top. This is just because that's the bare minimum that one can do to protect yourself in the open ocean from being eaten by a shark. All of the more colorful fish, they live closer to shore, where it's easier to hide. What I'm doing here is I'm drying out the paper. I saturated that paper pretty well in order to get these big blobs of color. You need a wet paper that'll absorb some of the water and allow the pigment to spread and slosh around. But once you've got your underpainting to a good place, you can't really do anything else with the painting until the paper's dry. So I hit it with a hairdryer. It's not the best tool, since all that air being blasted in the direction sort of can move the pigment around on the paper a little bit before it dries into places where you didn't necessarily want it to go. But it's a lot faster than just waiting for the painting to dry. What I'm doing here, I'm adding some tonal details. I've got a little bit darker brush loaded up. I'm dragging it around to show where the shadows and all the stuff are on the mermaid, at least the top half of the mermaid. Since the light is coming from behind my mermaid, that means all the shadows are going to be in front. This can be a very dramatic effect, but it's also one that's a little bit hard to find reference for, since most people, when they've got their pictures taken, they like to be lit from the front so that you can see them and they don't look like a spooky ghost. I kind of want my mermaid to look a little spooky, so you can see I've got all the shadows right smack dab in the middle of the figure. Just big chunks of darkness. And as opposed to the rest of the first layer of skin that I put down, This is a little less warm in color. It's a little bluer since the sun is red and orange in the background. It's hitting the back of her. That means the light coming from anywhere else is going to be a little bit cooler. Warm light, cool shadows. I've got my mermaid with its tail sort of curled around some sort of stalagmite. I don't know what it's called when it's, formed out of ocean water. Stalagmite is fine. I should note that all the water I'm using in my watercolor is distilled water from a bottle that I had to go to the store and buy and then drag home. I don't use tap water in my art, not even for cleaning brushes. That's because I live in the great city of Washington, D.C. And the water that comes out of our taps is extremely hard, which means mineral filled. Our water has a lot of mineral deposits in it, and if you use that to paint, those minerals come along with the pigment and end up on the paper. And if you use a wet technique like I do, you'll be able to see them. It leaves a sort of white deposit on the edge of everything that glitters a little bit, which is neat. But the little crusty white line around all the colors, that's not so neat. It's impossible to rub that out or make that go away. And if you do a lot of layers like I'm going to be doing, you end up with multiple white crusty deposits all over your painting. That's no good. But distilled water, that means it has no additives in the water, no minerals, no salts. And that's good for painting. And it's not too expensive either. The gallon of distilled water that I've got for my art, that's just hanging out in the studio. It'll usually last me a couple of months. And they only cost like $2, which is outrageous for something that you'd get out of the tap for free. But when what comes out of the tap is not maximum quality, I guess you just gotta pay what you need for what you need. My idea with the mermaid's hair was that it's sort of made out of gooey seaweed instead of actual hair. It's sort of slimy and flops around. But she's in such a pose that she jumped up onto that rock with enough force that her hair is flying everywhere and it's catching the sunlight. My wife liked that I was making her all creepy, and which took me by surprise because I always thought mermaids were a little bit creepy. They live under the water. They're half fish. They're not human. There aren't ever any tales of humans who become mermaids. They're just mermaids all the way down. You can't trust these creatures. And yeah, they're a little bit creepy. Now, from my research on the Wikipedias, mermaids first appeared, at least in the Western canon, in ancient Greek times. in the form of the sirens that Odysseus had to contend with on his titular Odyssey. Thank you very much, Homer. Originally, they were part woman, part bird. That eventually became part woman, part fish, because Odysseus is traveling in a boat. It's a nautical adventure. He's, paddling all over the Aegean, getting lost in pretty much everywhere in the Mediterranean except for the one place where his house is. So, if you have creatures that are intentionally causing shipwrecks, it just makes sense that they are creatures that can swim. Half lady, half fish. And the idea that they could lure men to their deaths probably also influenced the popular idea of mermaids as hot babes. I mean, there are also mermen and merwives and terms like sea hag. But these are all, at the end, half person, half fish creatures. Sometimes the sea hag has normal legs. Maybe she's part octopus or part frog. But those are usually just regional variations. Wherever people go to sea and wherever their boats sometimes crash, cultures will come up with stories about aquatic fish people who either save the drowning sailors or eat them. I'm drawing one of the ones that definitely eats people. What I've got in my hand there is a watercolor colored pencil. What that is it's basically watercolor pigment with just a little bit of clay added, stuck in the middle of a pencil, so that you can actually use it to draw and then get it wet, and it will act the same way that normal watercolor pigment does. The way I'm using it is to just lay down a whole bunch of pigment, because the color in these things can get really intense really fast. That's because watercolor pencils are opaque. You can't see the paper through the pencil. So you're only ever seeing the top sort of layer of the pigment, and you say, oh, that's not very heavy. I'll press down harder and I'll get more pigment onto the paper. But when that pigment is diluted, it gets a lot brighter and it turns translucent, and it just becomes a lot more vibrant in terms of color. So you have to know what you're getting into when, you switch up your supplies and mediums. I'm using it here to throw a little bit more color into the sunset, and also to add some more vibrancy into the little parts of the shadows of the mermaid. I think a lot of this didn't have quite enough time to dry. I didn't want to hit it with the hair dryer again, just because it was so loud. So this is an easy, fast way to lay down a bunch of pigment without having to go through the rigmarole of waiting for paper to dry. You can really just hit it with a wet brush afterwards and get some pretty cool effects. Like right now. Some people say they're afraid to use watercolor because every mark you make is permanent. I find that that's not the case. Usually, watercolor will give you enough play that, you know, you can shift colors around a little bit. What they mean, of course, is that watercolors have very definite edges to their color. If you slosh outside the zone of, you know, where you wanted color to go, you have limited options for reclaiming that space. But I think that just is a misunderstanding people have about how watercolors are supposed to be used, really. I mean, if you start very blurry and get more tight as the painting goes on, you can pull a lot of detail, and you don't have to necessarily worry about edges. They'll sort of resolve themselves. But just in case, you know, I've also got the pencils, and you can see I've got the handy dandy Bimoji Kiritaki brush pen at the ready in case I am not at all satisfied with the edges and the contours of my mermaid. I can always hide the mistakes behind a nice solid black line. One thing to know about watercolors that, you know, is definitely not true for oil paints or acrylics is that you want to paint from light to dark and just layer on the darker colors bit by bit. Sort of like putting gels on a theater light. Eventually you get to a point when the light can't penetrate the colored gels at all. That's your darkest color. But it's tricky, you know, with watercolor, since watercolor always looks darker when it's wet than when it's dry. You can see I'm adding pigment to the bottom half of this mermaid now. That won't be half as dark as I want it by the time it dries in a few minutes. And I'll have to hit it with another layer. The one way to get around this is to use, instead of watercolor paints, you can use water inks, which are permanent and a little bit harder to move around on the page than watercolor paints, since they start as a concentrated liquid pigment. But they also give you incredibly vibrant colors right out of the box. So, where you can see that sunset in the background, it really should be orange, sort of brilliant orange and bright marigold yellow, and it's sort of peachy and pale canary right now. Had I been using inks instead of watercolors, those colors would be punching you in the face. I don't use inks myself personally, just because I I haven't trained on them, and investing $7 or $8 a bottle on these inks that I'm not sure I may ever use again seems like something I'll wait until I've got a few more followers, and I'll try that. I think it's fun to use your watercolor paints to add texture. They're very good for texture. You can see the scales there. I'm leaving some white. Makes it look like the fish part of this mermaid is, extremely shiny, brilliant even. It's just reflecting all of the sunlight to the point where it's just solid white. I'm going to go through and turn that yellow because it is a yellow. It is sunset. It's not straight noon light. This rock was also kind of tricky since I have a definite shape that I want it to be. And I've just got to delineate that shape using only lights and darks. Were I a little bit more skilled of a watercolorist, I probably would have just loaded up my brush with an immense amount of pigment, and instead of doing 7 or 8 layers on the same painting, just done 2 or 3. You got a bright, you got a medium, you got a dark. That's honestly enough for me. But since I can't always guarantee that my medium is going to be medium enough for me and that my dark is going to be dark enough for me, I just have to keep adding layers until I'm satisfied. Sometimes that's how it is. Now, as I was saying with the light and darks, it can be kind of hard to get really dark darks with watercolor because you just have to keep adding pigment. And eventually, if you add too much, the board just becomes sticky and you've got globs of straight paint right on the paper. That's no good. But compositionally, I think it's important to have, a little bit of pure white and a little bit of your darkest dark, just to show the viewer the complete range of the world trying to portray. Since I am trying to draw something three-dimensional and light it realistically, there would be parts of this scene where light simply doesn't reach and therefore would be completely black, would be very dark. I'd have to use like a solid black ink to portray that. I don't know that I did. So what you end up with, if you don't have a solid black, is sort of a hazy world that may or may not be exactly what you're going for. This is why a lot of the cartoonists and comic book artists who use watercolor also sometimes rely on using a little black ink to accentuate the various parts of their pieces. It can really help using watercolor just for the coloring and the tonal shading, and then the nice crisp black line to differentiate figures and subjects and background. Especially since, the reader is going to see absolute black and absolute white inside the word balloons. So to make everything cohere, you gotta have a little bit of black, you gotta have a little bit of white. I learned that from Stephen Brodner's book, Freedom Fries. Came out 2 decades ago. If you can believe that, I still have it on my shelf. Stephen Brodner, political cartoonist. He uses watercolor. One of his tricks is to fill an entire spritzer bottle with watercolored water, and then he can spray that around his piece as he wants, and it gives a neat little splattery effect that goes well with his caricatures of screaming politicians. Now, when it comes to mermaids, there are, dipping back into the mythology, there are quite a few theories as to what sailors who swear on their share that they'd actually seen mermaids actually saw. Because we all know that sailors are decent, honest folk who don't just make things up wholesale. They usually, when they say they see a sea monster back in the olden days, people wonder what they actually saw. Was it a whale? Was it a dolphin? Was it a giant squid or an oarfish? Or, a whale shark? There are a lot of animals in the deep blue sea that can be mistaken for monsters if you don't know what you're looking at. These people, these sailors, mostly men, would catch a glimpse of manatees or dugongs, which are, a species of manatee. And these are aquatic mammals who like to lie on their backs. They've got little paddles. They've got roughly human-sized heads, not human-shaped heads. They look like big gray potatoes floating in the water. But if you were a sailor and you had no schooling and you were also kind of dumb and nearsighted, maybe you'd mistake that for a sexy lady with a fishtail. Other theories are sea otters who will drape themselves in seaweed. And, who knows, maybe a sea otter head covered with seaweed poking up from the ocean might look a little bit like a mermaid in dim lighting. Other times, mermaids may have just been women who were swimming. Certain parts of the world, women did not swim. Other parts of the world, women do swim quite often. If you sail from one of those previous places to one of the latter places, you might be shocked into thinking that a woman swimming was some sort of mythological creature. Since women have a higher lung capacity to body size ratio, if a profession requires one to dive and hold their breath for a really long time, say if you needed to fish for sea urchins or shellfish, just by nature, the demographics for that profession are going to skew toward the female end of the spectrum. In places like Korea and Japan, seafood diving is still a very woman-led profession. And I think in Japan, the divers, the local shellfish divers, are now kind of a tourist attraction. Because reasons, I don't know. These little metal details ended up being a pain in the keister because they did require a very thin, precise brush to pull off the effect. Could have gone for some sort of impressionist, blurred sort of thing. But the whole piece was already too cartoony to allow for that. I'm not painting light here. I'm painting a cartoon of a mermaid holding a sword and a gun. So once you've picked your genre, it can sometimes limit you when it comes to medium. Just working on some of the little fiddly bits. Undoubtedly my least favorite part of any painting. The tiny details that need to be taken care of. And if you've made it this far, hopefully I don't have to tell you to like and subscribe. That would really help the channel. It would really help the mermaid. If you don't like and you don't subscribe, Mermaid gets mad. And, you know, she's got a couple of weapons on her, so who knows what might happen from that. Plenty of people have tried to fake mermaids. You know, there's money to be made when it comes to fooling people. And it's easy enough to glue the bones of the aft half of a large fish to the hips of a female skeleton or a mummy or something. Like the one that currently sits in the Zoologisk Museum in Denmark. They've got a statue. Not even a statue, like a sculpture of a big rock. On top of the rock is a skeleton, top half of a human, bottom half of a long fish. I don't know how they made that. I don't know if they used a real fish. Probably not. It looks kind of fake to me because they just glued it onto glued the fish part onto where the tailbone attaches. So you have the sockets where in the hip where the leg bones would go. Where are the leg bones? You know, you look at the skeleton of a mermaid, you imagine the skeleton of a mermaid. It doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense. And then there's the famous Fiji mermaid, P.T. Barnum's sideshow. That was a monkey that they chopped in half, sewed the top half to a dried fish. Either P.T. Barnum made that himself, very clever, or he bought it in Japan, also very clever, but also that probably means that the Japanese guy had a warehouse full of these half fish, half monkey little dolls. And that P.T. Barnum's audiences weren't the only ones getting fooled. He was too. Even if he, you know, knew that it wasn't a real mermaid. Probably thought it was special enough to show people, to charge people to see. In Europe, there was a weird little tradition of catching stingrays, and you know, the meat on a stingray is all in the big flappy bits. Once those were cut off, you'd have this thing that if you flipped it over to the part where the stingray's nostrils and mouth are, they kind of look like a little face. And if you dried that out and split the tail, it sort of looked like a little person-shaped doll. They called these, for whatever reason, Jenny Hanivers. And I suppose that if you were dealing with some extremely gullible people, such as American Republicans, you might be able to sell them one of these stingray dolls as proof of living mermaids. And of course, everybody just frickin' still loves mermaids. There are mermaid statues in like 20 different countries. For no particular reason, just love mermaids. There's one, I think, in Denmark or Sweden or Finland, one of those Scandinavian places where Hans Christian Andersen lived. He's the guy who came up with the Little Mermaid story that Disney poached. He probably took it from an old folktale. But he got famous enough, I know his name, that they built a statue of the Little Mermaid and put it right there in the harbor for people to pet the head of, keep it shiny. A lot of mermaid statues in harbors. So mermaids are still really popular. The only reason I decided to do a mermaid was because of an art phenomenon, an online art phenomenon called Mer-May, in which during the month of May you draw and paint and color mermaids. This is one of the things that popped out of Inktober, which nobody does anymore because the creator of that has been canceled. But the idea of a monthly drawing challenge kind of spread. I think there's Mermaid. There's a bunch of different things for October. Possibly other things for June, July. I don't really know. Mermaid is the one that stuck in my head. So I'm drawing a mermaid. I used some of that the black pencil, and a little bit of, just a little bit of everything to finally get that really heavy black so I could paint her eye patch. And I also put an eye patch on her boob as a joke. I think it's funny. In a way, it's my way of making fun of prudish nature of American. I mean, for as long as I can remember, there have been bits of the body that you're not allowed to show on TV, and very slowly media companies are figuring out that people don't really care. Maybe not media companies, maybe it's just HBO. But the amount of body part bad, that's just ripe for mockery. What the mermaid's holding up right now, that's a cutlass. Or at least I hope it's a cutlass. It's what I can remember a cutlass looking like from the movie version of Master and Commander Far Side of the World. I don't think any of the ones in that movie were like gold and brass plated. But chalk it up to artistic license, and I think in the right light, say a sunset. The metal on your standard steel cutlass could be seen to be golden in color. Now, it may shock you to know, but I haven't actually done any watercolor paintings of water scenes. So I was kind of eager to try some of the tricks that I'd gleaned and pulled from other people's artwork, especially in terms of these waves. I've seen other artists in comics and in, museums and books and stuff doing this thing with water where in order to delineate a wave, you just don't fill in the very top of the wave, and that sort of mimics the glint of light on the edge of the surface of the water, and that creates an impression of waves without having to do a lot of mental gymnastics yourself. in terms of calculating how high said crest of water is or anything like that. And anything that creates an impression of matter without requiring a lot of detailed, thoughtful work is A-OK in my book. Growing up on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, I lived like a block away from an extremely successful and famous watercolor painter named Mark Castelli. He specialized in, I don't know if you'd call them seascapes, but depictions of marine life. And I don't mean marine life like fish, I mean marine life like the lives of fishermen working on the Chesapeake Bay, which was also very close by to where I lived. These paintings, these watercolors would go for thousands of dollars. He'd figured out the sort of painting of light and how to depict everything extremely realistically, but also loosely in a way that made water feel wet and everything feel very tactile. And I'm pulling my painting of water a little bit from the techniques that I've seen in his paintings. You know, sea spray is really fun to paint in watercolor because it's just about like poking little holes in the foam. And the more you do that, the more the foam takes shape. And the only real skill you need is the skill to know when to stop. Of course, I don't have necessarily his skills. This isn't a $1,000 painting, which is why I'm using whiteout to add to my sea spray. Now, when I said it was all right if the color bleeds a little bit, I was lying. And it really, sometimes you just need to throw solid white back onto the painting where you'd already covered it with paint, and now you can't really pull it back off again. Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can get your brush wet and sort of drag it along the paper, and that'll scrape up some of the paint. But that's its own effect. It looks a specific way, and it doesn't look like sea spray. So I'm throwing some white paint out of there. In normal watercolor, kind of watercolor that I'm doing, white paint has been described as poison by my teachers. I understand where they're coming from, which is why I'm doing the white paint last, because you can't apply watercolor on top of white paint and expect it to work the way it does on normal paper. The water and the pigment are going to sort of mix up with the paint, and it's going to turn into a sort of pastel, half transparent, half opaque, sort of slurry. That's not really the look anyone is going for when they're using watercolor. If you want sort of that pasty look, you should probably use gouache instead, which works the same way as watercolor, only it's completely opaque, and instead of drying lighter than it looks, gouache always dries darker than it looks when you're painting. Historically, gouache is used to create sketches for oil paints, since you can reconstitute it and mix it over and over and over again in the same way that you can sort of shift and blend oil paints even once it's on the canvas. Soggy, soggy bandolier. Not quite a recognizable shape. It's sort of stretching even though it's supposed to be made out of leather. And we're just throwing in some little extra details. But you can also see where the sort of underpainting, the wet on wet underpainting is shining because it adds a little diffusion to the subject. It makes it look a little bit airbrushed. You get a softness to certain areas that require a softness, and extra layers on top of that, which were wet on dry. You get a little bit more of a hard edge. If I really wanted to continue on with this painting, I'd start doing some dry on dry, just letting the paint on my palette, on my little box of paints, dry out until it was just barely sticky, and then I'd go over everything and sort of scumble and scrape the paint onto the paper and give me a nice solid rough texture. But since this is an aquatic, a marine painting, I don't feel the need to do that. I wanted everything to look a little bit wet and glistening, just as I wanted this mermaid to look as menacing as possible. You know, this isn't the saving the drowning sailor mermaid. This is definitely eating and robbing a drowning sailor. I imagine everything she's got in her hands, and the earring on her ear and the eye patch and the bandana all came from drowning sailors whom she helped along into the comforting and briny grip of death. I don't know where she got that giant eye patch for her boob, though. She might have just made that. Or maybe there was one sailor with just a huge eye. Actually, it would have been a sailor with like a huge socket, whereas I had been. All right. I'm just adding some details to the face here. I feel that's a really important area of the mermaid to focus on, you know, because everybody's got a face, and part of interacting with the world as a human being is being able to read facial expressions. So we humans have gotten really, really good at it. If you're depicting facial expressions, it can be the difference of 0.5 millimeter. That is the difference between one expression and another, one emotion that you're trying to capture versus another. So it's worth a lot to spend your time getting the expressions right. You know, we're working on glove, big leather glove, which doesn't really belong on a pirate ship or anything. It's more of a cavalry officer glove. But, you know, if you've got like a leather glove and it gets wet, it immediately becomes waterlogged and stiff and crusty and almost impossible to like use your hand inside of it. And when you take it off, your hand's all wrinkly and you got like trench hand. but I wanted to draw, you know, like a pirate boot, a big floppy pirate boot. Mermaid's got no legs, so I put the boot on her hand as a glove. And now we're just tidying up the face, adding a little delineation. Got some of the muscles, some of the lighting, just a little bit clearer so we can read that ferocious expression she's got on. Death to humans, yar. That sound in the background was the cat being extremely upset about absolutely nothing at all. Or maybe he threw up. I'll find out in about 5 minutes. Oh, and I also gave that mermaid kind of little gremlin ears, just to make her a little bit less human. And that's my mermaid. Took longer than I expected, but I think all in all it's a reasonably good piece. I don't know if you could hear that, but the cat definitely did just throw up. I'll clean that up in a second. But like I was saying, that's my mermaid. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to click the like and the subscribe button. If you click the bell icon, you can get notified when new videos drop, and they do drop every Wednesday. If you'd like to support this channel, you can come find me on Patreon and on TeePublic as P. Hostetler Art. That's where you can go to get a little bit closer, to see a little bit more of my art. And until next time, stay sketching, stay legendary. I'll see you later. Now to check out that cat.